Wokingham Today is hosting a series of leader interviews ahead of the local elections on Thursday, May the 5th. The leaders will begin with an opening statement and then answer questions on 5 topics. At the end, they will be invited to make a direct address to you, the voter. Wokingham Today has also prepared ward pages on its website, giving you the chance to meet the candidates standing in each ward. Today, I'm joined by leader of Wokingham Labour, Rachel Burgess.
I think there's a number of reasons why local politics is important to me. I think it's essential that we have a wide diversity of voices in the council. So we need councillors and people to represent us who actually properly reflect the communities that we serve. In order to ensure good local democracy, that is essential. So if you look at our current council, 2/3 of the councillors are men, for example. So we need a greater diversity of gender, but also of age, of ethnicity, etc. Because we should be genuinely representative of the residents. So that's really important to me. I think it's also really key that we have a strong opposition on the council. So I think whatever your political views, I think most people would agree that a strong opposition is good for local government. Our council currently is dominated by the Conservatives, but I've seen just in the 4 years that I myself have been a councillor, how much of an effect the opposition can have to provide those checks and balances over what the ruling group are doing. And I also think, to be honest, we need to tackle some of the complacency that's come with a party who has been in charge in Wokingham for so long. So in the last few months, the Conservatives have spent a lot of time saying how brilliant the council is, thanks to them. Literally one meeting recently, one executive member finished a speech by triumphantly saying, "Thank God for the Conservatives." And I think that kind of complacency needs to be really tackled. When I'm hearing from residents, every week who have real issues, we need to tackle that. But lastly, on a sort of personal note, I would say that just helping people with their issues is rewarding, and it's the right thing to do. And if I can be an advocate for someone, and if Labour councillors can be advocates for their residents and help them get what they deserve from the council and from its services, and if we can help to make our areas better in some ways, then personally that's really important to me too.
Okay, I think the first topic that I think a lot of residents and a lot of councillors can agree is a difficult subject, because various targets and also resident feeling is development in the area. So I think the first question is, I know in your in the Wokingham Labour manifesto, it says you would aim to take the local plan update and rewrite it. What specifically is the main bugbear with the plan update in its current form? What would you actively look to change?
I think that the key thing would be putting sustainability at the heart of it. So, we've got basically a once in a generation opportunity with the local plan to put sustainability at the heart of our development. So I mean, energy efficient homes, I mean, infrastructure that allows safe walking, safe cycling, infrastructure that allows really good public transport. We need to get all of that right now. And, we in the local plan, we should be demanding the highest possible standards. I think that, there's other areas, obviously, things like protection of green space. We've seen how much green space has already been lost. We should be protecting that for people's quality of life, for the environmental impact, etc. We need housing that's actually placed in the right situations. So not next to a sewage farm, as we've got one in my current ward at the moment, or on flood risk areas. It needs to be in the right place. So I think overarching, I think the sustainability piece would be the key thing that we really just need to get right, and we should be demanding the highest possible sustainability standards in our local plan.
Okay, thank you. I think also everyone accepts that new homes have to be built. It's a rising population. There's government targets. They're currently at 768 homes per year. It's a fine balancing act, but how is the best way to balance resident concerns with there's too many houses, they're too close to where I live, or like you said, there's not the infrastructure, but also still keeping up with government targets, which are kind of enforced on any council?
Yeah, I mean, government targets, that they are too high it is one of the top issues that is raised with us as councillors. People feel that there are too many houses in our area and not enough infrastructure to go with it. Now, the Conservatives spent a lot of money on a consultation on this fairly recently, which told us what we already knew, to be honest, that most people think the numbers are too high. But the Conservatives are still supporting things that will increase the demand for jobs and increase the demand for housing. So, for example, they voted for a third runway at Heathrow. That will increase jobs in the area. That will increase the demand for housing. They support the new film studios at Shinfield. Again, that will increase the demand for housing. If we want fewer houses in our area, that demand needs to be spread out more evenly. But as I say, I mean, when it comes to the sites for those houses and the way that it's managed, and where those sites end up being, people do feel like their views on that are ignored. So we do end up with development in the wrong place, such as right next to the sewage farm. And we've seen a lot of our green spaces, our fields, etc., being lost forever, which obviously has a high environmental impact and an impact on people's quality of life. And I think this all, for me, it comes down to the power that developers have over the Conservative Party. So they've poured millions and millions of pounds of donations into the Conservative Party. And it's not surprising if they want to see a return on that investment. I mean, the last manifesto, the general election, included some changes to planning laws, which have now actually been paused. But they would have seen a massive boost for developers, as they would have had much more right to build anywhere and much more of a weakening of local democracy when it comes to planning. But yet the local Conservatives, to bring it back to the local Conservatives obviously campaigned on that manifesto that included those changes. We'd be calling for those to be scrapped completely. But I think, overall, that the overall picture is really difficult. But I think when you look at the donations that flow through to the Conservative Party from big developers, it's not really surprising that we're in this situation.
Okay, thank you. I think something that all three parties have agreed on, which is interesting, and it's mentioned in all three manifestos, is the need for the right homes, so affordable housing in Wokingham. I think from research at the start of this year, the average house price in Wokingham was around £415,000. I think we can all agree that for a lot of people that is unattainable, especially if you're looking to get on the property ladder. And what can be done really to encourage developers to build more social housing, more sort of purchasing schemes, whether that's the part rent, part buy, or your first home scheme where you receive a contribution towards the deposit, that kind of thing. I mean, what can really be done to encourage developers to do that rather than chase the large profits of like a 5-bedroom lovely property that's, say, £750,000?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, we're getting a lot of houses in our borough, but it's not solving the main problems. Lots and lots of younger people can't afford to buy, and people's housing costs are just, often unaffordable. And due to the price of housing and the housing market in Wokingham, what is defined as affordable is often clearly not affordable for lots and lots of people. Now, in terms of what we can do, the large developments, the usual requirement would be 35%, but to be affordable housing, inverted commas. But actually only 20% of that actually has to be housing on site. The remaining 15 can be covered by monetary payments to provide facilities elsewhere. But I think in reality, the demand is probably more like 50 or 60%, when sometimes we only just get 20% on a new development. And that's why there was so much criticism when the Carnival Pool site, there was no affordable housing on that site at all. And I think in terms of the local situation, that there's been a lot made of the new Gorse Ride development by the council, a number of affordable homes being built there, but they don't always count the ones that they've actually knocked down as a part of that development. So I think in reality, we've got about 70 new affordable homes there once you take that into account. And I think with probably another issue that comes up locally as a councillor is the housing associations that many of these affordable homes will be run by. There are some good ones, but there's also some less good ones, and they don't seem to be run for the tenants necessarily, and because they're not in the council's control, it makes it very hard to intervene as a councillor to try and help when housing associations don't perform in the way that they should. So I think overall the solution to all of this would be to build more council housing. So our council has built hardly any council houses in the last 20 years, like 10 or 11. And to me, that's just a shocking state of affairs. We need thousands of council houses, actually, genuinely affordable housing in the council's control, which would take a lot of people off the housing waiting list. Those lower rents would then have dampening down effect on the market in the area. And it would also allow people to save for a deposit if they wanted to purchase a home. So what we have at the moment is landlords effectively being subsidised, private landlords being subsidised by the taxpayer through universal credit housing benefit. What we really need, what the real solution is many, many more council houses.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to move on. It does link in slightly with development with regards to infrastructure, and move on to the topic of schools. Now, the council has admitted that this year, despite increase in secondary schools such as Pigott, Embrook, St Crispin's, and a proposed increase at Bowhunt, depending on approval, there is still a shortfall of secondary school places in the borough. With increased development, you would expect it to bring more young people, students, children who will need that school space. What can be done to increase that, given the likely increase in young people coming into the area?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to mention on this is that due to current policy, many schools are, they're no longer in control of the council, their academies or free schools, okay? So the shortage in school places locally has been made worse by the existence of these academies. So you've got this bizarre situation where the council has a legal duty to ensure adequate school places, but generally it's only academies and free schools that are allowed to provide those additional places. But the council can't direct them to do that because they don't control them anymore as they used to with maintained schools, or most of them anyway. So they're autonomous, they're setting their own admissions policies. And actually that's part of the problem, because the council has to basically negotiate wherever it can and try and use its influence, but it can't direct them to increase places in the way that perhaps it once could. But I think that's an issue, and a Labour council will be pushing for a change in policy on that, so that there was more local control over that. But I think there are there's other issues with education that we should also be talking about that have an effect locally, such as the poor provision for children with additional needs. So the Conservative record on special educational needs provision is appalling. And funding cuts over the last 10, 12 years have had a really bad impact on that provision. Also, in terms of the sort of wraparound picture, if you think about it, the early years of a child's life are extremely important. And again, children's education is starting much before they go to big school. The early years, there's still not enough provision for free childcare hours, for example. And there have been cuts to things like Sure Start, etc., which had a big positive impact on children's lives, but a lot of that's been cut. And that will flow through to children's schooling and education outcomes. At the other end of the scale, there's also been cuts to further education and adult education, massive cuts in that sector, which affect people's life chances, but also just their quality of life if they don't have access to that training. So I think there's a number of other issues that we also need to focus on. I think in terms of school children, I think the pandemic has certainly highlighted the attainment gap between children of different backgrounds, and how keenly someone's income disparities can affect children's progress and attainment. So again, that's another thing that needs to be tackled. So yeah, school places is key, and it is an issue here. But I also think there's lots of other issues with education due to Conservative policy that also need to be focused on.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned the way that the secondary schools are run, and a lot of schools, like you say, they're academies or they're out of council control. If unable to change the policy, is it also about opening up the communication between schools and the council to try and encourage them to, whether that's change their boundaries for school places or to increase their SEND provision, to use their budgets in different ways? Is it about opening those communication channels up a little bit more as well?
Yeah, I think it is. But I think, to be honest, I think the council will already be doing that. They'll be doing whatever they can to negotiate and talk to the schools and do that. I think the way the policy is at the moment, that they can try that, but at the end of the day, they can't direct them. So yeah, I think it is about that. But I suspect that that's already happening.
Okay, perfect. Well, I'd like to move on to probably the toughest subject with regards to it impacts everyone. It impacts councillors, it impacts residents, it impacts business, and that is the cost of living crisis. A lot of people accept that a large portion of it is outside of the control of a local council. Things like the pandemic, the fuel prices, the cost of energy to heat your home, and then of course the impact of the Ukraine war. But within a council's remit, what do you think can be done to help residents to try and alleviate some of that pressure of the cost of living crisis?
Yeah, I think that there's a number of things, approaches the council should be taking. But let's just acknowledge how hard people are being hit by this first. I represent one of the more deprived wards, but we've had universal credit. It's been cut by £1,000 a year. We've just had a rise in national insurance tax. We've had a rise in council tax. And Wokingham itself is actually in the top third of council tax costs for comparable authorities. Obviously, we've got rising food prices, petrol prices, and a massive rise in energy bills. So it's really, it's really starting to bite. I think the council's anti-poverty strategy, it needs to be a lot stronger in a few areas. The draft strategy itself had objectives in there which talked about supporting and strengthening people's resilience to poverty. To me, that's basically accepting poverty. That's not anti-poverty. We should be a lot more ambitious. Our objective should be we will do everything we can so that no one in Wokingham Borough lives in poverty. So a lot more ambition, but I think that there are specific things we can be doing to show leadership on it. So that a lot of issues will be around actually in-work poverty. So a lot of people, for example, who are claiming universal credit are in work, but they're still living in poverty. So one thing Wokingham Borough Council could do would to become an accredited living wage employer, to show that leadership that we will pay people a fair wage. And I think finally, in terms of the council's control, the council can do a lot to help, but there is only so much they can do without changes in government policy. So the council should be lobbying the government for changes. It should be lobbying the MPs in this area. We've got 4 MPs in our borough, should be lobbying the MPs so that, on things like universal credit cuts. The Conservative leaders refused to raise this with MPs. To me, that's saying, well, he's happy for residents to go to a food bank rather than having cash in their pocket to buy their own food. We should be lobbying on the recent tax rises. We should be lobbying on energy policy and fuel poverty. Labour have got a plan, which is a windfall tax on fossil fuel giants who are incidentally making massive profits out of the increases in prices. That sort of thing would save real money for our residents. So I think the council, it's right that there is only so much they can do, but they can't just claim to be really passionate about relieving poverty, about helping everyone actually with the cost of living crisis, if it isn't lobbying the government on some of these really, really key issues. Instead, we've got people already, relying on food banks and local charities. And unfortunately, it's only going to get worse. We're seeing the biggest drop in household income on record. So there is a lot more that the council can be doing.
Okay, and you touched on the draft anti-poverty strategy. You clearly think it needs to be a bit more robust in what it can do for people. Is there any specific changes that you would make to it in its current state? I know it's a draft strategy. There was further funding allocated towards it a few weeks ago. I believe it was £500,000. So is there anything in particular that you would like to see change that would really hit the nail on the head for sort of key people that are affected by poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the strategy, I really welcome the fact that the council are working with the charitable sector in Wokingham on the strategy. That's really important. These are the people sort of on the ground who know what the issues are. So that's a really positive thing. But they need to make sure they're listening to them and acting on what that they are saying. I think in terms of the key things, there are aspects of leadership. So, for example, being a living wage employer, that would send a message that this council respects proper wages for people, and I think that it's overarchingly it would be the overall ambition. We don't want any poverty, and we will work towards having no poverty in Woking Borough. And it's that lobbying piece, because there's only so much the council can do without changes in government policy. So I think that those are probably the two things that I would change.
Okay, thank you. I've read over the Conservative manifesto, and one of their key points on this topic is the council tax reduction scheme. What are your thoughts on the council tax reduction scheme as a policy?
Yeah, so that's a scheme that helps people with their council tax bills. But if you look at how much we've helped people with that scheme over the last 10, 12 years, that the amounts have reduced massively. So it is important that the scheme's there, but I think it's quite a small part of what we do, and more needs to be done.
Okay, so moving on slightly, the next topic that I'd like to cover is something that a lot of residents have spoken about. It's been covered quite a lot in our paper and with petitions, and there was a march in Wokingham Town Centre about it, is antisocial behaviour. And this, of course, takes various different forms. We've had things like car meets, there's been, drunk and disorderly in the town, and Thames Valley Police have acknowledged that there is a rise, especially following the pandemic and even during the pandemic. So what can the council do in collaboration with the police to try and reduce those number of incidents?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. This is one of the top issues that is raised with me as a councillor and with us as councillors. And it can range from quite low level antisocial behaviour to the more serious. But even the low level antisocial behaviour, if it's repeated, it can really affect residents' quality of life. The top priority on this is always going to come down to needing more police. So if you look at the more serious types of crime and the rises in, for example, knife crime recently, and then you compare that with the massive cuts in funding to the police numbers over the last 10, 12 years, that's allowed drug-related crime and gang-related crime to have this awful effect on knife crime with tragic consequences in some cases. There just aren't enough police officers, and there aren't enough PCSOs. They're still suffering from that decade of cuts. And the sad thing about that is it was a political choice by, it started with the Conservative and Lib Dem coalition and subsequent Conservative governments to cut that police funding. Now, I work quite closely with the local policing team in my ward, and they're brilliant. They're really good, but there's so few of them. It's really, really hard, especially if there's any kind of incident. So, a car meet, for example, if you've only got sort of 3 police officers covering a really, really wide area, it's really, really hard for them to respond. So they're doing a great job, but they're really suffering from these cuts. And, on some of the more low level stuff, I've tried to take some action myself in my area. So we've set up a speedwatch group, community speedwatch group in our area, this is a Thames Valley Police scheme that monitors traffic speeds in areas where residents know there's problems. So things like that can help. But I think in terms of the bigger issues, it really comes down to a lack of police due to funding cuts at the end of the day. We don't have a police station in Wokingham anymore, and people really feel that.
Okay, thank you. You touched on it there with regards to the bigger topics, but one that has been at the forefront of a lot of people's minds is the car meets. Now, I know recently in the council, a public spaces protection order was introduced that will increase the scope for people to have on-the-spot fines. Do you think fines for people, racing their car up and down the street or spinning round roundabouts, is that enough, or is it more about education and interaction with that community, specifically the car meets, to try and say, we have no issue with you showing off your car, but don't race it up and down the street? And it's a fine balance.
Exactly. There's got to be limits, hasn't there? I mean, there's nothing, we're not going to be wanting to stop people who have a love of cars, but there has to be a limit, and there has to be, it has to be reasonable what happens in particularly in residential areas. And I think the measures you outline will help, but I don't think they will be enough. And I think that there are other things that the council can do with regard to restriction in car parks and things like that. I mean, there's a park and ride about to be opened in my ward at Keephatch Gardens, Copley Beach, near Copley Beach roundabout. And there's lots of concerns about that being the next area for car meets, because there's no gate, there's no barrier at all. So, there are things that the council can also do in terms of its infrastructure to discourage it in, what is a very, very much a residential area. But as I said before, I think at the end of the day, without a rise in police numbers, it's going to be very difficult to control this issue.
Okay, thank you. So we'll move on to the final topic that I sent over to you, which is council and governance. A very broad subject, and is more about the ethics in which things are done, so the way that the council is managed. So after May the 5th, Labour could have a strong impact on the way that the council is managed and how decisions are taken. Is there anything in particular that you would like to see changed as a priority in the way that the council does its business, whether that's including residents and consultations, or how decisions are taken and things like that?
Sure. First I would say that, however many seats we win at these elections, unfortunately, Labour won't be running the council because we won't have enough seats. So we're not going to be running the council this time. But if we were, we would be working for the residents of Woking. We would be putting them first. We wouldn't just be towing the party line. We'd be putting our residents first. And that is at the outset of our manifesto. I think, there are policy changes. Of course, there would be policy changes, for example, the need for more genuinely affordable housing. But I think overall, the biggest change would be that of a culture change. So we would have a more diverse, a more modern, a more progressive council that would have the residents at its heart. The political culture that we would set would be one of respect, one of honesty, and as you touched on, one of genuine engagement with residents. I think in recent years, the Conservatives' record on consultations is poor, and that you lose trust of your residents when that happens. So I think all of that culture change would then flow into aspects of the policy that would be set. I think that the ruling party in Wokingham at the moment in Woking Borough are really out of touch with the lives of most residents. And I think that needs to change. It's really the culture is set at the top, and that would be the main thing that I would change, which would then flow through to all aspects of council policy.
Okay, perfect. I think another element of council and it's the way that it's run is about managing budgets. The council isn't excluded from the cost of living crisis. It isn't excluded from things like inflation. So when it comes to spending on improving, it could be anything. Is it also about making sure that it's not irresponsible spending like some councils nearby who have gone financially or are financially sort of damaged by overspending? Is it about making sure that it's a balance between the two?
Yeah, of course it is. But I think it's very easy to compare different local authorities, but Wokingham is a very wealthy area, and that has an impact on its finances. But yeah, of course its financial management is really, really important. And of course that, the council's support from government has been absolutely slashed over, as part of Conservative policy. And that's had a really big impact. The Conservatives will say, oh, no services have been cut, but they will use terms like demand management, which it's a cut in anything but name. So yeah, of course that's important. But all councils are struggling, and I think Wokingham is a very affluent borough, and that will have an impact on the robustness of its finances.
So when it comes to Thursday, May 5th, people will be going to the polling station and they'll have multiple choices in front of them. Why should they support their local Labour councillor and give more control to Labour with regards to decisions that are being made? Why should they vote for their Labour councillor?
Okay, so if you vote for a Labour councillor, you would be voting for a strong opposition on the council. So I think whatever the political makeup of the council and whatever your political views, I think a strong opposition is vital for good local government. And we need a strong opposition to hold the ruling party to account. And just speaking of that ruling party, our local Conservatives actively supported and campaigned for our current government at the last general election. And many people on the doorstep have been disgusted by the whole Partygate scandal. And the local Conservatives have been silent on that. So I would also ask voters to remember that a vote for the Conservatives, every vote for the Conservatives here will send a message to Boris Johnson that actually people don't care what he's done. They don't care if he broke the rules. They don't care if he lied about it. And that is how the votes will be received by Johnson. And I know that people do care because they tell me about it on the doorstep. But a vote for a Labour councillor would be a vote for a councillor who will always put the residents first, not just toe the party line. You know, that is at the forefront of our manifesto on page 1. Our duty is to put our residents first. And I think the last point I'd make is that you'd actually be electing a very hard-working councillor. It's actually really tough for Labour candidates in Wokingham. We have to work really, really hard just to get elected. And we've shown in the last few years that this work ethic carries on when we are councillors. You know, we have to keep working. We will keep working. We'll never be the kind of councillor who just pops up at election time. So if you do elect a Labour councillor, you are voting for a strong opposition on the council, for a councillor who will work extremely hard and who will always put you, the residents, first.